Well, welcome everybody. I'm Kathleen McCartney, Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and it's always nice to have a full house. And we not only have a full house, we have people watching in overflow space. So I want to welcome all of you who are watching from there. I guess it's no secret why we have a full house tonight. I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Atul Gawande, who is joining us to present a talk tonight entitled The Difference Between Coaching and Teaching. I have a feeling you all know a lot about him, which is why you're here, but let me just tell you a few things. He's a professor of surgery at Harvard Medical School. He's also a professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Harvard School of Public Health. He is the lead advisor for a World Health Organization program entitled Safe Surgery Saves Lives. He's the founder and chairman of Lifebox, an international not-for-profit implementing systems and technologies to reduce surgical deaths globally. And he is a general and endocrine surgeon at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. I happen to know he has operated on at least one person in the audience, but I can't reveal. HIPAA, you know. Dr. Gawande has also been awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, and he was named by Time magazine as one of the world's top 100 influential thinkers. And somehow he finds time to be a staff writer for The New Yorker, to write 3 New York Times best-selling books, most recently The Checkbook Manifesto. Malcolm Gladwell, in his review of the Checklist Manifesto, wrote, "This book begins on familiar grounds, with his experiences as a surgeon, but before long it becomes clear that he is really interested in a problem that afflicts virtually every aspect of the modern world, and that is how professionals deal with the increasing complexity of their responsibilities. From pit crews to cowboys to airline pilots and superintendents, Dr. Gawande has become an expert on experts. Tonight he will discuss how different professions produce top-level performers by sharing lessons from a wide variety of disciplines and illustrating the difference between coaching and teaching. What could be more important to folks at the Graduate School of Education? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Atul Gawande.
Thank you. That was, are we working? Oh, good. Thank you. That was a very kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a little embarrassed to talk to teachers about teaching, so I have to demur to begin with. I got interested in writing and in research because of wanting to understand what you do. When I started writing and actually started doing research was when I was in training myself. And what I was interested in was trying to become something more than just competent at what I was learning to do as a surgeon. I wanted to understand how I really become good, or perhaps even someday great, at the kind of work that I was doing. And in order to do that, I wanted to understand the difference between those who are merely competent and those who are great at what they do. And what I found was, over time, trying to follow and emulate and see people who were really focused on achieving something more than competence, was they weren't smarter than anybody else. They weren't geniuses. Instead, they seemed to be people who had come to grips with their inherent fallibility and the fallibility of the systems that they work in, and with what it took to overcome that fallibility. And that's where my own writing started. My first article for The New Yorker was as a third-year resident, and I was really shocked that they took the article in the first place. But then second, that there were people who were interested in these kinds of questions. And I've just had the lucky fortune that the things that have been obsessions for me have turned out to be ones that seem to resonate for some people, even to the point that I might be asked to come to the education school to talk about teaching. So let me try to get away with it. Part of what's interesting is the idea that there is a distance between being competent and being excellent. In many lines of work, that doesn't have to be the case, right? There's only a distance because there is complexity. There's a distance between competence and excellence in very hard tasks, but not in very simple ones. If you have a deck of 3 cards, and your job is to count how many cards are in the deck, there is not a very big distance between being competent and being great at what you do. But if what you have to do is teach 7th graders, or what you have to do is do an operation, or help someone stay healthy, or make a government program you're responsible for work, or start a business, there's a big distance. And that is characteristic of complexity. In fact, it follows a curve. And for helping professions like ours, what makes this very trying, because we act in public, we are making promises to a larger group of people about how we're going to perform, and what makes that distance between mere competence and excellence unnerving to people is, A, there is a distance, and B, it doesn't look like what people expect it to look like. So anytime that there's measures of what performance looks like in what I know well is medicine, and so we see across a variety of fields that there is a wide distance between the best and the worst who do our work, and that the pattern of the picture between the best and the worst is a bell curve, where most of us are grouped in the mediocre middle. I suspect that's true in teaching. It's a natural way that complexity plays out. But it is not what the public expects. What the public expects is that after all of those years of training and getting a little bit of practice under your belt, that the performance curve would look like what I'd call a shark's tail, with all of the folks grouped towards the very best results, except for a few stragglers down here at the awful, crappy end. And if we were serious about improving the quality of teaching or the quality of medical care, we'd cut those crappy people off at the knees, fire them, and we would be great. But when it's a bell curve, and it's just a few at the top, but miles ahead, it feels like, where most of us are, it's just disturbing. It's disturbing for the public, and it's disturbing for us, I think. Well, we have many examples in surgery and beyond surgery in medicine. In most of the areas that we look, we keep finding a bell curve. And so, for example, if you look at pneumonia care, one of the basic kinds of conditions that we've been treating for many decades, there is a wide gap between the best and the worst, and most are grouped in the mediocre middle. For one of the simplest operations that I do, a hernia repair, the chances that you will have that hernia repair fail in the first year after surgery is around 5%. That's the average performance. But it turns out that there are places, I wrote about a place called the Schuldeis Hernia Factory up in Toronto, where they've made a real art of taking care of this particular very simple operation and gotten the failure rate down to below 1 in 200 instead of 1 in 20. And at the upper end, I learned in a study that I helped a team conduct that there were places in the country where the likelihood of failure could be as high as 25%, 1 in 4. It was a bell curve. You see it in cardiac surgery, you see it in lots of different fields. The one that interested me, though, was a different one. It was the bell curve for cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is a condition that an inherited condition, a genetic disease that children get at are born with and show symptoms of at a very young age. It's a terminal condition. The average life expectancy is, at the time that I was looking into this, around 35 years. And there was, however, a wide bell curve. And that was interesting to me because cystic fibrosis worked exactly the way that we want medicine to work and many professions to work. So the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, with patients and doctors working together, their families have instituted a system where their care is concentrated in 117 centers of excellence around the country, where the teams have tremendous experience in taking care of kids with this condition. They have formulated standardized guidelines for care perfected around what seem to be the very best practices. They've got their checklists for how the care should really go. They have public monitoring of their results. So you can go onto the web and find out exactly how your center that your child goes to is doing for survival, for the lung function that your child has, and their weight, two critical measures of what's going on. And this is thought to be a way that you can raise the results and bring everybody to an extraordinary level of performance. And in fact, it's been remarkable over history, because with this kind of approach, we've brought survival in cystic fibrosis from just 6 years of age to now, as I said, an average of about 35 years or more. But even with all of that, there's still a bell curve, and a wide one, with the best places achieving survival rates of 47 years and higher. A difference of 12 years in a person's life. And down at the bottom end of the curve, you'll see places where the average survival is in the mid-20s. And so then the puzzle was, why does that happen? Where does this come from? And so I went to one of the places in the middle to find out just exactly what were they doing badly? What were they screwing up on? And I went to a place, the University of Cincinnati Children's Hospital, that by all accounts should not be in that mediocre middle. They were actually below the average performance in the country when I was visiting. And it was a puzzle, because this is one of the top 10 children's hospitals in the country. The director of the cystic fibrosis program is one of the leaders of cystic fibrosis care. He helped formulate many of the guidelines that would be the ones to follow. It was, the equivalent of a great charter school, right? And yet, when you saw the measures, the survival wasn't keeping up. Well, I went thinking that maybe they've got a fantastic reputation, but they really don't deliver when you go and visit. Not a problem that I would have ever heard of here in Boston, but maybe out there this happens. And what I saw was incredibly dedicated people. They had more than 250 kids with cystic fibrosis. They knew them inside and out. They were dedicated to them, and the families were dedicated to their medical teams as well. They seemed not to miss anything as I went through in the clinic, and they just carried out a flu vaccine campaign that ensured that every child, they got to 100% of making sure every child had gotten their flu vaccine, something that pediatric practices don't normally manage to execute on. So then I decided, well, I need to visit a place at the top of the curve, because they must have a secret drug. How else to explain why this place would be at the very top of the curve? Now, one way they may be at the very top of the curve is because they had healthier kids with cystic fibrosis, right? There are a variety of different mutations, and this is the equivalent of saying, well, this school has really poor kids, and you could say, well, this program has really rich kids. Only they're rich genetically, maybe. Maybe they have one of the mutations that are less severe than the most severe mutation. The most severe mutation is called the delta F508 mutation. And that mutation, when you measured it, it turned out that this place, which happens to be the University of Minnesota Center at Fairview Hospital, run by a guy named Warren Warwick, this center has more of those kids than the average place. Their reputation had got around, and many of the sickest kids end up coming there and yet they continued to do better than the average. Well, as soon as I got there, I asked Dr. Warwick, show me your protocols, show me exactly what it is you do. What he showed me were the same protocols. There was no secret drug there. They were following through on the same lines of care and getting strikingly different results. So I did not understand what it was that they could be doing differently until I went with him to clinic and saw what it was like to be a patient there. And it was strikingly different. I can only explain it by telling you an example of a patient. One of the patients we saw that morning was a young woman named Janelle. She was 17 years old. She had cystic fibrosis diagnosed since the age of 6, and she was there for her routine every 3-month checkup. She had dyed black hair to her shoulders, Avril Lavigne eyeliner. She had rings in both eyebrows, stud in her nose, stud in her tongue, several up each ear. She was facing off in the other corner against Dr. Warren Warwick, 76 years old, tall, stooped, and frumpy looking. He looked like a British academic in his tweed jacket with the liver spots on his hands. And he tried bantering with her. How are you doing, Janelle? Fine. How's school going? Fine. How's your health been? Fine. He said, let's pull out your lung function measures. And he pulled out a graph that showed exactly how she'd been doing. And what it showed was, your lung function is critical, by the way, because with this disease, it accumulates dried secretions that are like glue in your lungs, and you have to take medications and physical therapy treatments to keep those lungs open. Well, her lung function measures showed that she'd had some ups and downs and had a dip from 109% of predicted to 90% of predicted. And what that means is that she had been at 109% of normal, actually better than the average child with normal lungs. And she'd had a little dip down to 90%. And I had seen the charts at the University of Cincinnati and knew well enough that these kinds of dips are to be expected. There are ups and downs. These measurements are not precise. But that was not the way Warren Warwick saw it. Why'd your numbers go down? He asked. I don't know. Well, have you had a cold? No. A fever? No. A cough? No. Well, what do you think could be going on? Don't know. Well, have you missed any treatments then? No. Haven't missed a single treatment? Well, everybody misses a treatment once in a while. Well, how often is once in a while? And gradually he got out of her that for the past 3 months she'd not been taking her treatments at all. Why aren't you taking your treatments? He wasn't surprised. He didn't seem angry. He seemed genuinely curious, like he'd never seen this sort of situation before. Well, she said, I don't know. And he kept pushing. Well, what's going on? I don't know. Is there something keeping you from taking your treatments? I don't know. Well, what's going on up here, Janelle? And he tapped his forehead. I don't know. So he decided to take a new tack and use me as some kind of foil. So he started talking to me. And he goes, cystic fibrosis patients are interesting. They are good scientists. They are always trying to experiment. We have to help them interpret what they experience as they experiment. So your experiment is stop taking your treatment. And what happens? Nothing. Let's take a look at the math. And he had a little blackboard that obviously looked very well used. And he said, let's ask, what is the likelihood that if you have cystic fibrosis and don't take your treatment, that you will end up in the hospital with a bad lung illness on any given day? And the chances, he said, are 0.5%. And he wrote that number on the board. What are the chances that you'll end up in the hospital if you have cystic fibrosis and you take your treatments? The chances on any given day are 0.05%. Seems like hardly any difference at all. You basically have a 100% chance on any given day of being well. But add it up over the course of the year, and what do you get? And he jotted out the math, which actually was very impressive because this involved exponentials on the board. And he figured out that the chances of being well on any given day if you took your treatment, chance of being well and being out of the hospital over the course of the year was 83%. But the chances if you didn't take your treatment were 16%. He turned back to Janelle. He said, Janelle, how do you stay well all your life? How do you become a geriatric patient? He said, I don't have the answers. I can only tell you the statistics. And that, I realized, in that little description to her, was his entire worldview of what it meant to be great at what he did. Excellence was not a matter of being bad versus good. It was the difference between being great at what you do versus competent. It was between being 99.5% successful on any given day and 99.95% successful on any given day. And there are lots of things like this. If you play for the Red Sox, catching fly balls. If you work for FedEx, it's delivering overnight packages. If you make microchips, it's getting the microchips made. The only difference in the kind of work that teachers do and doctors do is that people's lives are affected in those slim margins. And so he went about trying to find that slim margin for Janelle. First, he tried to sort out more about her life and what was going on. And what he gradually figured out was that she had a variety of things that were keeping her from being able to take her medicines. She had a new job that she went to after school. And so at the end of the day, she was not going home like she normally did to take her medications and the nebulizer treatments and the physical therapy vest that she has to wear. And then she had a new boyfriend. And he also was 22 years old. Dr. Warwick did not approve. After school, she would go to work. After work, she would go to his apartment and still not get home for the treatments. And then at school, they had new rules that you may know about, which is that the kids couldn't keep their own medicines and take them on their own. They now needed to go to the school nurse. She needed to take her medicines twice a day, once in the morning and once in the early afternoon, and she hated going to the nurse and announcing her illness and getting out of class. And so she began to skip it. It's such a pain, she said. So he made a deal with her. He said, after school, I need you to be able to go home for your treatment. I can talk to your boss at work and make sure that there is enough time. Also, he asked her for the phone number of her best friend and permission to be able to talk to the best friend so the best friend could hold her to taking the medication. It's a trick he clearly had worked out when you start having teenagers do well. Then he said, as for your medicines that you take in school, keep your key medications in a bag or in your pocketbook and then take them on your own at school. She stared at him. They won't let me. Don't tell them. And with that, he deftly turned taking care of herself into an act of rebellion. So far, she was okay with this plan. Oh, and there's one more thing he said. I want you to come to the hospital for a few days in order to get some intensive treatment and catch up on the ground that you'd lost. She gave him that stare again. Today? Yes, today. How about tomorrow? We failed, Janelle. It's important to acknowledge when we have failed. And with that, she began to cry. I've thought a lot about what Warren Warwick did with her and what it did across his entire practice and what it meant. There were a few things that he did that seemed to me to be in common with those who manage complexity and succeed. One was that he had moral clarity about his goals. He had goals, yes, but he was also very clear morally what was important about the goals, what he was really shooting for. And for him, it was keeping this child alive until they were old, which meant he wasn't going to be able to do it all. He would have to figure out how to help her be able to do it all. The second thing he had was an understanding that this would require diligence. By diligence, I mean that the details create the success. One of the characteristics of complexity is that small things can amplify in nonlinear ways, in ways that have extraordinary consequences. Missing her doses of medication here could mean an 83% chance that she would end up in the hospital a year later, and then a likelihood that she'd never make it to old age after that. It was a story that I understood from also the case of John Wooden, the extraordinary UCLA basketball coach who managed to win the NCAA title 10 out of 11 straight years. I mean, an unprecedented feat. And one of the stories he tells is that when his freshman squad arrives on campus and arrive for their first day, he has them go through some teaching that he does for them about how to put on their socks. And he shows them himself. He takes off his shoes, takes off his socks, gets out the socks, and he explains, you have to roll it up and then start at the toes, and you pull it very carefully around the toes and up the ball of the foot, and then around the heel, and then up the leg, and you smooth it out the whole way. He showed them and he made them do it exactly the way he was doing, and then he did it again on the other foot. And he had a reason for doing this. Number one, he said, blisters end your season. And a wrinkle in a sock not only ends your season, it ends the likelihood we're going to win. But the second reason, as he wanted them to understand, is that details create success. The third thing that Warren Warwick understood was ingenuity. Ingenuity in how he could solve this problem that Janelle had by trying out these tricks, like having a friend who he could call and connect with and help hold her responsible as a peer, and take approaches like having her hold her own medications and take them herself. But if he did that all by himself in a system of colleagues that were treating close to 300 cystic fibrosis patients every year, he would just be great at what he does, but the others would be all along the bell curve. So he instituted other forms of processes that required equal ingenuity. For example, one of them was that he had a simple meeting every week on Tuesdays where all of the pediatricians and the social workers and nurse practitioners, everybody would meet together to talk about every patient they were going to see in the coming week. I mean, I've never had anything like that before. Never had someone looking over my shoulder and asking questions and saying, what's happening with our patients or our students along the way? And sitting in this meeting, it was routine. Any issues with this patient? What's their lung performance? What's their weight for height? The two things that he tracked incredibly diligently. And then there would be a few, though, where there was a problem. Why did their numbers go down? Why were they in the hospital? What was going on with that absence of a week from school? And then he'd find out what the plan the team had for being able to do it, what that pediatrician seeing them planned to do. And he didn't hesitate when he thought it was something that could go better. He would push. Some of the pediatricians who didn't like this quit. I talked to one who was incensed by the ways in which this guy thought he could tell him what to do. But the others were incredibly dedicated to this whole process because they had now gone more than 15 years without a single teenage death, something that virtually no program in the country can say for themselves. One of my favorite essays is an essay by the philosophers Alistair McIntyre and Samuel Gorwitz. And what they wrote about was the nature of human fallibility. And what they pointed out was that there are two reasons why we fail at anything that we set out to do. One is ignorance. The knowledge simply does not exist. And the other is ineptitude. That is, the knowledge exists, but an individual or a group of individuals fail to apply it correctly. What's fascinating to me about our time, our particular generation, is that both have become our struggle. For millennia, the human condition was we lived in a world of ignorance. We did not understand that much about the physical world, the conditions that afflicted our body, how to raise people's ability, educate, and do all of those things. It was kind of discover as you go along, do the best you can. We were in a world of ignorance. But after the 20th century, we have come through with a tremendous storehouse of experiences, knowledge, and science that have shown us many ways in which at least we know what the bad things to do are, and often what the most successful things to do are. And we've found that both are our struggle. Being able to solve our problems of ignorance that still remain, how the economy works, and what to do about Alzheimer's disease, and how to get seventh graders to care. But there are also tremendous storehouse of knowledge of the people who are at the top of the bell curve with information and capabilities that have not translated downward. Performance is turning out to matter as much as the discoveries of technology and everything else. But our question has become how to replicate the results of those who are at the top of the bell curve, the Warren Warwicks of the world. How to make it so you can actually change the curve, not just for you and where you stand on it, but change its shape, pull it upward and tighter, and begin to alter that. That, to me, is the story of education. It's the story of trying to find an answer to that question. In the absence of education, people are simply splayed randomly across that curve, learning the best they can. But with education, we change the shape of that curve. The ways we educate have become interesting. That we have teachers and doctors following, I think, in our professional lives, a classically pedagogical model. We all go to school for a long time. Then they make us go even longer in medicine, pay a lot more tuition along the way. Then you graduate. And the expectation is that you've gained your experience, your internships, your field opportunities. You gain a little bit more experience when you're out there on their own, but then from that point on, your job is to improve yourself along the way. You are responsible for your own self-improvement, and it's understood to be a lifelong process, that you will seek out education, you'll seek out opportunities, and our job in education is not only to teach you all the key things that you need to know at that moment in time, it's also to equip you to learn for yourself. And that has worked extraordinarily well. It is how Juilliard teaches musicians, for example. Itzhak Perlman graduated from Juilliard, and he got his 10,000 hours of experience from the age of 13 till he graduated there, and then was put out into the world. Not yet the world's greatest violinist of his generation, but someone who would learn, had been equipped to learn how to rise to that level. It's a training that inculcates the ethic of self-perfectionism. You keep developing your capabilities. In stark contrast to that are athletes. The athletes never feel that they're done. If you're in tennis, watch tennis, this is Rafael Nadal, this is Djokovic. They have had coaches throughout their whole careers hit number one, and they don't fire their coach at that point. They feel they still need them. And in that world, the view is that the teaching model is naive about human capacity for self-perfection. They believe that few can achieve and maintain their best possible performance on their own. Well, I wasn't sure what to believe about this. As a surgeon, we are in the camp of the non-athletes. And so I decided to call up people who were at the very top of their curve, who had come through that system, to ask how they had achieved that place in the pantheon. For example, I called up Itzhak Perlman, and amazingly, he answered my phone call. It's one of the beauties of, hi, I'm from the New Yorker. Saying hi, I'm from Harvard these days doesn't seem to be quite enough to get them to call, but the New Yorker. And I asked him, why, for instrumentalists like violinists and so on, do they not have coaches, but pitchers and tennis players do? And he said, I don't know, but it's a mistake. He always had a coach, he said. His coach was his wife. He married Toby Perlman, who was a classmate of his from Juilliard, a concert-level violinist, who gave up her career playing to be in the audience and watch how he performs and push him. She learned various things along the way. When he asks afterwards how it went, she always says, it was great. And then a couple hours later, or maybe the next day, bring up, you know, there was that section that sounded a little bit mechanical. Did you feel what I was hearing? And what he said to me was, the great challenge in performing is listening to yourself. Your physicality, the sensation you have as you play the violin, interferes with your accuracy of listening. So his wife, Toby, has been that extra ear for him for 40 years. And that had been key, he believed, to how he got to where he got. Okay, that's how it works for a world-class performer who's trying to shoot to be, you know, the best in the world. What about us ordinary people who are just trying to do as well as we can with our own talents? How do we move up at least towards the Warren Warwicks, the Itzhak Perlmans? And part of what was fascinating to me is that coaching has come to teaching itself. I think this is something that you know. What struck me was the research from your field showing that the biggest factor in how much a given student learns isn't their class size, it isn't the amount of testing they do, it's the quality of their teachers. And for policymakers understanding this, the results have been the effort to adopt what I'd call carrot and stick remedies. Fire the bad teachers, penalize the schools with low performance, give merit pay to give bonuses to those at the top level. Well, others are suggesting, you know what you do? You coach them. There have been studies of teacher development work by a researcher named Bush. Some of you maybe taught this in your regular lines of work. It was new for me. And their work in California showed that professional development, as it's ordinarily done, didn't work. You would go for a workshop, you would learn some essential skills for teaching English or teaching math. You would even get to practice them in a mock session, be observed, have simulation, have a chance to really pick up on it, and then you'd go back to your school and you'd give it a try. And when they circled back 6 months later, the chances that they were actually using any of the skills they learned was less than 15%. In another arm of the study, however, what they did was the same kind of workshops and so on, but then they sent a teacher around who was familiar with the concepts to just watch them in class and give them a few pointers on how they did with it. And just, it would be 2 or 3 visits, but after 6 months when they circled back, the likelihood that they were using the skills they'd learned was more than 85%. And that was the difference of coaching. Coaching programs now have grown, as I understand it, in somewhere around 200 school districts around the country. And the data seems to be still early in evaluation of whether it really changes the end point of how well the students learn. And so I went to visit one simply to get my feel for what it was like. It was the Leslie Walton Middle School in Albemarle County in Virginia, and they followed an instructional coaching model in which they had coaches offered for experienced teachers and mandatory for novice teachers in their first 2 years of entering the profession. And so I went alongside a coaching team who observed Jenny Kreitzer, an 8th grade math teacher who had 10 years of experience. And that particular day, she was trying to teach the 8th graders how to simplify radicals. This was a mid-level class. This was not the accelerated class. This was kind of the standard class, which is to say a class of kids who wanted to know why the heck they were learning anything about radicals. And her task was to get them to grasp 3 highly abstract concepts: the concepts of radicals, of perfect squares, and of factoring. It struck me as incredibly difficult to be able to do this. And in 60 minutes, she did just that. It was extraordinary. I didn't see how it was possible that it could be improved. But the coaches always think there's something to improve. And so when they sat down with her afterwards, they broke it down for her. So in the teaching world, you've done what we've done in medicine. You've recognized that there's a bell curve. You've looked at the positive deviants, those getting the best results at the top of the curve, and then broken it down, understood a few things. And so what they recognize is there's multiple domains that come together to do this: being able to manage student behavior, how you do your classroom preparation, time management in the classroom, effectively using different learning structures for different styles of learners, and so on. Jim Knight, who is a pioneer who runs the coaching center at the University of Kansas, teaches coaches, and he teaches teacher coaches to observe specific details. He's developed a kind of standardized method of even coaching with a checklist, and it's kind of a checklist for what great teaching would be. And the questions that they ask and run through as they watch is: how effective was the planning for instruction? How are they able to interact respectfully with the students? Are they engaged in high-level conversations? Do they understand how the students are progressing or failing to progress? So afterwards, they went through that list and asked her to pick her area that she wanted to work on. Actually, it wasn't afterwards. They had planned that as early in the month as what they were thinking about working on. And what's interesting about it is there's a debate over whether you tell them what they need to work on or you have them pick what they want to work on. And the reality that Jim Knight explained to me is that the teacher knows. Usually the teacher knows. The novice teachers struggle with behavior. but not Jenny Kreitzer. Her concern was whether the kids were really engaged. This was towards the end of the year. They had some high-stakes tests coming up. She was having to teach to the test. She was worried it was feeling like she was teaching to the test rather than engaging the kids where she wanted them to be engaged. And the coach said she was right to be concerned. Now, I never caught this, but what the coach noticed was that there were at least 4 kids who seemed at sea. They were at different parts of the room, and so they sat to recognize what new strategies might be for them. When he pointed out the names, she said, "Yeah, I think you probably are right." And so they thought about the strategy she'd used. She'd had them pair up that particular day, and what the ones that were at sea turned out to be were the ones who were in girl-boy pairs. There was no communication going on. And so rather than break them up into same-sex pairs, they worked on some tricks to be able to make them more successful at being verbal. And she had 3 more classes across the course of the day, and she tried out those tricks and found it had gone beautifully. And she said to me afterwards when we caught up that this was her experience over and over again. She said, "I'd exhausted everything I knew how to improve on my own." And in fact, she'd reached the point after 10 years that she was burning out a little bit. She felt isolated. And for her, coaching was a tidal change for her. She had a lower stress level. She felt more effective. And what I saw for the school district was they kept a great teacher and actually got to see her improve. Now that, I thought, was worth trying for. I was in my 10th year, am in my 10th year as a surgeon. And I felt like I'd run out of my own tricks for being able to improve. You know, coming on board, your learning curve just feels like it's straight up in the first 3-4 years. And then it sort of starts leveling out. And then I felt like I was very good at the stuff that I do, but I also could recognize that I had plateaued. And so I asked a retired colleague who was one of the teachers I'd really admired and liked a lot when I was in training, and he had since retired, and I asked him if he would come back and just watch me operate. And it was incredible. He's incredibly observant, and in 20 minutes, he saw things that I didn't even understand I'd been doing. He pointed out, for example, that during the operation, we sat down for about 20 minutes after the case. He sat through just an hour and a half long operation, a neck operation. And he said, one of the things that you do is your elbow goes in the air when you're at certain points in the case, and that means that you are you're being awkward. You're not in an ideal position. So that means you need to change your instrument or move your feet so you can stand in the right way. He said, you were developing tunnel vision. I operate under magnifying loops that let me see all the nerves and everything. And with that, I wasn't recognizing that there was, during the case, some trouble that the patient was having, and the anesthesiologist was needing to raise their blood pressure. And she just said, you need to be aware of those things. You need to be able to scan more regularly. Also, he said, with that magnification, you didn't realize the light was out of the field for more than 30 minutes, reflecting off of surfaces in order to allow you to go ahead. He pointed out the ways in which I'd missed the opportunities to make the team work better together, and that I missed some key opportunities to teach the people the resident that I was working with. The ultimate test, I think, was that over time I started to see my complication rates get even lower where they'd been flat before. It's hard to know if that's going to be sustained, but so far, over more than a year, and I've had him come back every month, it has continued to be the case. The final test, though, is not just whether I get better, but whether we as a team get better in the same way that Warren Warwick was trying to make his entire group of physicians successful. And I'm just a piece of our little school, our little charter program. Educating a child, I think, or caring for a person's health is evolving identically in many ways. We're under tremendous public scrutiny. It has become far more complex than what it used to be even just 2 generations ago. Teachers are now teaching 8th graders math concepts that Euclid would have struggled with. And doctors are diagnosing and treating more than 13,000 different conditions that human beings can have. I don't think anybody works harder than teachers and doctors. I don't think anybody's better trained, and yet society is frustrated. We have a wide bell curve for our performance, and when you look at the wide bell curve, it's also a bell curve for costs. And there's no relationship between the costs and the results. Many of the most expensive places are places that are getting perfectly mediocre results. And the places getting the best results have almost no relationship with the costs beyond a certain point. What you see instead is the places that are the positive deviants are the places that are most like a system. We're all specialists now. We all just have pieces of the job that we do. And we have little attention to thinking about how you get all of those pieces together. Lots of great people, but not necessarily a great medical care or a great education. And that's been a disaster. It's been a disaster for the costs. It's been a disaster for those we're trying to serve. Our ultimate role, I think, is to be able to drive as a group towards end results. And that means that we individually are not left alone in whether we're contributing to that final result. That is a very painful transition for us as doctors, for educators as well. Being rated by students on the internet or by my patients on Yelp. Autonomy and respect as professionals for whatever judgments we make has been one of our highest values, and we feel rewards for what we do. But under conditions of complexity, where how well a student does depends on not just how one teacher does, but multiple teachers connecting along the way, and how a patient does can depend on dozens, sometimes hundreds of people needing to pull all the pieces together. Under conditions of complexity, we are still training, rewarding, and hiring people to be cowboys. But it's pit crews that we've needed. The values, when you work together, when you submit to coaching, when you try these ideas, the values that you end up expressing are quite different from ones of autonomy. They are humility, a belief in discipline, a willingness to engage in teamwork. I'm a surgeon, you know how exactly difficult that is for us, right? The prospect, though, I think is important. Our North Star is what you see when it all goes right. What you see when someone grasps an idea they didn't understand before, or is simply better. And I think what you know is the reason to think about these things is that we change lives. And that is a privilege and an opportunity, and I thank you all for being part of it. We have 2 microphones in the aisles, and welcome any questions that you have. If someone wants to try kicking it off.
I'll hazard a try.
Yeah.
Is this on?
I think so. I hear you.
Great, thank you. I'm at the Community Charter School of Cambridge over in Kendall Square, and we're doing a lot of the coaching that you described and having a lot of success with it. My fiance is a surgery resident in the Longwood medical area and is getting trained. And seems to get some coaching, but often seems like people make mistakes and they get yelled at. And I'm just curious your thoughts, whether at a school, a hospital, on changing the culture within kind of these institutions so that coaching is possible.
Well, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
When it works well, how did you get it to work well? Because I'm sure there are coaches who yell at people, right?
Yeah. So what we did at our school, putting me on the spot, what we've done at our school is we basically established a firewall in between our evaluators and our new teacher mentors. So our evaluators are coming in every 2 weeks unannounced and doing a lot of coaching, but it's hard because they're the evaluator and it's and they at the end of the year we're non-unionized. They decide at the end of the year whether somebody comes back. So we also have new teacher mentors. I'm one of them, who part of our job is to come in about once a week to observe maybe 15 minutes and give some coaching. So we did those firewalls.
So you had some crucial ideas that were embedded in this that I think make it clear what's difficult about it. So number one, being a principal at a school where you decide to pay for people to coach and then you don't get to ask them what the results are is very, very difficult. But when Jim Knight observes this in the work he's done, when the coach is brought in and are specifically reporting to the principal, people think they've just had a spy implanted in their classroom, and they aren't there at all for their improvement. They're there to be the police, and this doesn't work well. Well, some of this is embedded in healthcare too, right? So when I'm training a resident, it's with someone that I'm responsible for. This patient I've made promises to and that we're needing to execute on. I also have 4 other cases that I got to get in the day, and we got to be efficient and move right along. And next thing you know, you're yelling at them because like, God, come on, let's get this going here. And I'm their evaluator and part of the team that decides whether they go onward. And when I decided to get a coach in, I decided to get someone who was retired, and it was for a reason. I asked one of my colleagues to come watch my operation. We rarely watch each other operate. I was doing a case that he does a lot of, I did fewer of, and he just couldn't stand it. He was like, oh my God, no, I'm scrubbing in. And the next thing you know, he was taking over. And I didn't even agree with the way he was going about it. And whereas with this guy, Bob Osteen, who'd retired, his malpractice insurance had lapsed, his license was gone. He couldn't do a damn thing except watch, let me struggle, and then bring it back. Not reporting to anybody, not doing anything. And that core intentionality of how you set it up is probably a huge part of whether it's going to be successful or not. Do the people understand that their role is that? Now, in sports, it's highly variable how this looks. So if you're a tennis player, you fire the coach. You're paying for the coach, you hire and fire them, and so they know you are their client. If you're the basketball coach, you bench a person and decide, we need to be the winning team here. And it's a much more tenuous process. A college basketball coach like John Wooden has enormous power. A professional basketball coach with their multi-million-dollar marquee player, it's a little bit more difficult how you massage egos and manage along, but at least you have the advantage of transparency. Everybody sees how the game really goes, and the coach can use that to their advantage in being able to show what happens. Our worlds are invisible to most other people, except in the most egregious cases. And so that person who's in that room is really the almost the only external eyes and ears of what is possible, and setting them up for success is crucial.
Hi, I'm a school principal in the Boston Public Schools, and I was struck by the examples that you gave were all kind of idiosyncratic type guys.
They were much more interesting, aren't they?
And Dr. Warwick, the way he talked to the teenager, the guy with the socks and so on. And I'm interested, I work in a school system that has 128 schools, and 128 principals, and more than that with the assistant principals and so on. And you also work in large, bureaucratic, complex organizations, and I'm interested in your thoughts about how one can build in the support for idiosyncrasy as a source of innovation and improvement within a large bureaucratic organization.
Yeah. Well, part of the way I took away the idiosyncrasy was these are extraordinary leaders, right? Warren Warwick, the way that Itzhak Perlman pulled apart his own practice, and that on some level this was a story of talent and leadership that couldn't be replicated, and you would have a hard time transmitting that. In fact, I had a kind of skeptical end to that story when I wrote about it in the New Yorker magazine several years ago. And the time since then, the University of Cincinnati has been visiting and following along. They didn't have some Warren Warwick kind of character, but following the lessons, recognizing what the opportunities were, and simply going in with a culture of improvement. They have now climbed into, from being below the median performance, now into the top 15 of 117 programs across the country. And we've seen over that time, because they've visited and connected dots, ways in which they've called it their Pursuing Perfection program, they've lifted the whole curve upward. So the median survival has improved for cystic fibrosis. So in a large organization, scaling to me has meant understanding how you create that education process where people value it and see it as a routine in what they do. I recently wrote about the Cheesecake Factory. And the Cheesecake Factory was interesting to me because it's a place that delivers 80 million meals a year at 170 places across the country. And in their rearview mirror is Olive Garden, and they're trying to stay several steps ahead of them, and they deliver a phone book of food, 330 items across all different kinds of ways of doing things, and they make it all from scratch at every restaurant. They don't have the prepackaged box of crab cakes that you pop in the microwave. And in order to take people who are chefs and believe they are chefs and be able to corral them in the right direction, they really have had to institute a real process of coaching. And the striking thing to me is that they've institutionalized it. They have every 6 months a new menu and a new set of things that everybody works on, even beyond the menu, how they do service, how they deal with reducing waste and so on. It's this incredibly orchestrated rollout that starts out as an idea in their test kitchens, ideas drummed up from the restaurants all across the country, filtered out, and then brought to be a few key things. Their equivalent of their school superintendents fly out, their regional managers fly out, learn what those things are. But more than that, unlike in our medical world, they also then are observed teaching what they are being taught. So if there are 13 new dishes and several new service ideas, they're actually observed not only in how well they can do it themselves after 2 days of training, but then also observed in how well they can teach. They bring those ideas back, and they installed coaching all the way up down the line. They have educators who follow along with them and watch them as they teach locally and stay with the teams as then it becomes teachers teaching more, and it fans out across the way. And then 6 months later, they go through it again. And this idea that there are a few things that everybody is learning together, that they're trying to achieve as a system, seems so far removed from the normal way we do things in medicine. And yet we know that the way we adopt and bring new ideas in it doesn't work in medicine. For new guidelines of care, new discoveries, the average time is over a decade before it reaches half of patients, unless it makes you a lot of money, then it moves a lot faster. The prospect of being able to institutionalize the ideas then I think comes down to they've made it a twice-a-year kind of thing, and then they've also recognized we're going to filter up all the best ideas, and we're only going to do a few of them, because people will choke on massive amounts of indiscriminate, disorganized change. And so I felt like there are some key lessons in those ideas in how we make it possible for people to move along. I don't know if that resonates for
A
you.
quick follow-up. Is it a two-step process that Dr. Warwick, as an individual, does things, and he doesn't get in trouble when the pediatricians quit on him because
He's
got
the
enough
boss.
Right, right. But he's not in the belly of the organization, right? And then the second step is the institutionalization. And I'm just, if you could
So I
comment on that.
think there's a key part of this, which is, do you have to be a player to be a successful coach, right? And the answer is, it's not clear. There are great coaches and teachers who didn't necessarily play the game, and there are great ones who did play the game, but they all know the game, and they are believable. They have credibility when they are talking about the way you play basketball, the way you do your operation, the way you teach. And that credibility is really fundamental. It's earned in some way, whether it's in the classroom or from years of teaching lots of folks. And it's earned because you also seen lots of other folks, which is something that the person who is mid-career hasn't necessarily seen so much. And the cultivation of that credibility strikes me as really important. It can arrive in a variety of ways, but I think is crucial. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Wande. Thank you for joining us. My name is Divya. I'm a teaching fellow here at the Ed School and a student at the Kennedy School. One of my takeaways from the conversation is that coaches can often serve as observers and mentors to facilitate our own reflective process, often through asking questions. And I've often thought of patients and students in a similar way, in that they're both consumers of a service. So patients are consumers of their own healthcare, students are consumers, should be consumers of their own education. And so with students, I've thought that coaching students can actually help facilitate that learning process, thinking style, reflection that could inevitably, I hope, improve student outcomes, intellectual development, et cetera. When I heard the Dr. Warwick example, I actually thought, the way I interpreted the example is that Dr. Warwick was actually coaching his patient through asking questions about what's going on in your head, what is the behavior that maybe has led you to miss your treatments. And so my question for you is there opportunity for patient empowerment or patient education through coaching our patients? Is this being done, and kind of how has it been effective, or how do we know if it's being effective?
So the short answer is yes, and the longer answer is no. The short answer is yes, there's now a whole movement around being able to give people more knowledge and tools for being able to guide care effectively yourself. But no, in the sense that the tools are not very sophisticated. They're sort of, there's things on the internet and there's various ways that people have put things together, but the idea that this is something that can work across the entire spectrum of patients that we see, from ranges of being very sick or low levels of cognition, all the way up to young media savvy consumers who can diagnose themselves on the internet and order their own prescriptions from CVS and that kind of thing. That map of diversity is what we have to be able to move toward, because what we've had are very one-size-fits-all kinds of approaches. And it's very clear that, especially for patients with chronic illness, many of those patients are better informed than their doctors about their conditions, and better able to understand and guide and help take care of themselves and contribute as part of the team who are making this go. On the other hand, when I've got a patient unconscious on the table, they're in a very different position along the way. And so being able to recognize that for primary care, where we can help facilitate, I think, an important coaching process of identifying, what are your 3 biggest goals for your health this year? And what are the biggest things that you can do to work on it? And there have been some software companies that have then even been able to take that physician encounter and turn it into a little package that will email you a reminder, and you can set the reminders. It can be daily, it can be weekly, it can be once a month, about your particular health goals. To the chronically ill person who, again, has a set of goals, but these might be around taking your medications and following up on some key things. To the very sick patient in the emergency room or in the hospital, there are different ways and opportunities to connect, and we're only just beginning to explore and understand them. Yes.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk today. And my question is, I'm going to flip that discussion a little bit and just about coaching involving listening skills and sort of using the patient, not the unconscious patient, but patients and students as they coach us in some ways. I read this article in the Atlantic Monthly recently where they did a survey of kids and found they had all these questionnaires and measures, and they found students are extraordinarily accurate as a whole, not the disgruntled student, but in predicting which teacher doesn't do his or her job. And that's been instituted. I think the Bill Gates Foundation now funds a study that incorporates that questionnaire now, which wasn't earlier believed or given as much value. So what are your thoughts on that? And why not ask the patient? Why not ask the student? Even though they may not be 100% accurate all the time, they can give us very valuable information as a coach.
It's clearly relevant in medicine because the ultimate measure of whether an operation is a success or a course of care for non-operative care or just your preventive care goes well, the ultimate measure is whether it's a success for you, not to the doctor. And it also is clearly the case for students over time as well. There's a whole movement in medicine now called patient-reported outcomes, and controversial because many colleagues will feel that the patients couldn't possibly report successfully on what their outcomes are. But it's been now shown very clearly that it's no one can, in many of these instances, they're the only ones who can report on the outcomes. If you've had a knee replacement, the ultimate measure is 6 months later, are you walking better? Are you having better function in your life than you did before? Being able to accurately measure it and pick it up is now a whole science, but it has been demonstrated to be reproducible and highly credible and very capable. And allows layers of much greater transparency than we've had in the system. And it's more sophisticated than just the Zagat survey. Although even at that level, understanding what service looks like and how well people's experiences go are important measures that people want to know about. We are in a huge struggle right now around how transparent we are willing to be, how ready we are to collect that kind of information and then put it out in the world and let others measure us. I think it's crucial to our future that we be able to do that for two reasons. Number one is that in the absence of this information, I don't know myself who the best people are in my field. And if I want to get those results, I want to know. Cystic Fibrosis Foundation is the unusual part of medicine that has made public their results and trusted that the public can understand some places might not be as good looking as others for more complicated reasons than just there being not there. And I think this is something that we are struggling with in education, in healthcare, in all these fields where measurement is full of lots of complexities. But the outcomes that the people we're trying to help actually report are probably our closest measure of what we're ultimately trying to produce and succeed at. So I don't think that this movement is going to go away.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Gawande. I'm the sort of human surrogate to the digital world following along. So I have a comment and a question from Twitter. The comment is from a man in Newton. Exceptionally effective soft-spoken speaker establishes an easy intimacy. Thank you.
Oh, well, thanks. I'll take more. What else you've got?
And the question is from a woman in Boston. She writes, in education, who should we ask to be our coaches? How do we identify them? And then how do we use them?
This was very interesting when I was in Albemarle County because the coach that I followed around was a teacher who was still in his mid-30s or so, I think, and had only been teaching for about 7 years. But he was also a baseball coach. And when they had the applications from people to become one of these teacher coaches, they were really looking for people who had shown the capability of being able to work with peers and others in that particular way. And they came from all different kinds of walks of life and experiences. They had to interview them, and really, getting a bad coach can be really detrimental to people's performance. It's a very sensitive kind of position if you don't have credibility to start with, or number two, if you have credibility and convince people to start doing things that aren't going to help very much in the long run. And so bring me back to the nugget of that question. Were they asking what the attributes were, or I forgot it, what is again? Oh, where do you find them? Yeah, so they did not make they did not go to coaching schools for teachers. It's not institutionalized, and so what they brought it up from was the teachers in their own school district who were willing to play this role for their colleagues and participate. There's two different movements, I guess. There's one that's called peer coaching and another called sort of more formalized instructional coaching, and they had combined the two. They had chosen peers, but then given them some training for a couple of weeks ahead of time and cultivated their skills as coaches and had them constantly reading about coaching and meeting other coaches and understanding what they really do. Yes?
Thanks very much. I really appreciated your
probably
presentation today and
last
your
question.
article on the Cheesecake Factory as well. That was excellent.
Oh, thanks.
But my question to you is, as we all know that online education is here to stay, schools like Stanford, MIT, and Harvard are into it big time, and as it continues to explode, what are your thoughts on how it's going to affect teaching and coaching?
Yeah, I've been really fascinated by the online teaching experience and been a skeptic myself. And then my kids started using things like Khan Academy, where they could find lessons and learn in particular ways, watching videos and going back and relearning. You all know about this work a lot more than I do. And what's clear is that there is not a substitute for the one-on-one relationship that matters, but that there is some ways in which effective online education can build in feedback loops that are kind of like, my car is teaching me how to drive a little bit more energy efficiently. It's got that little green ball, and when it goes out of range, that means I'm speeding up too fast and that kind of thing. And what struck me about seeing some of the online tools like Khan Academy and others that they have is that they've built in ways so that, if you have mastered the work and you answer a bunch of questions right, that you can move on to the next higher level work. But if you are not able to answer the questions right, it can raise the level of training and focus that you get, and also make it clearer what needs to be flagged by a teacher and get that one-on-one attention. I don't see that online work being able to substitute, however. Now, whether we can get that sophisticated, I don't think it's cheap to make those kinds of tools. I don't think it's also the natural inclination. When I thought of putting some of my own teaching online, I mostly thought it was going to be, stand up, do videotaped lectures, and then see what happens. And that clearly is a less than successful model, having in a way that it becomes interactive and manageable by the person who's learning on the other end, and a feedback loop getting set up seems to be where the opportunities come from. So I think it's sort of like, my impression is it's sort of like the music industry, that MP3s and digital music didn't kill CDs and didn't kill vinyl. It just fragmented it all, and we've got it all proliferating along the way. And in education, it's just many, many channels that seem to be proliferating. Even the one that you let me have today. So thank you for the chance to visit with you, and I appreciate all your work.